that's bringing my whole self, which is might be part of it. But like for me, the focus is on like, who are you as a person more than how you're outwardly expressing that.
What we really mean, perhaps, when we talk about bringing our whole self into everything that we do is learning how to steward who we are in a way that's always available, so we can always pull on all of that intelligence. Whether you want more innovation more easily, you're feeling burnt out or overwhelmed, or you simply know that something isn't quite the way you know that it can be, you are not alone. I hear the same from leaders every day. On Uncommon Leadership, we explore aligning personal fulfillment with business success, creating authentic teams, and cultivating the resilience, adaptability, and ease necessary to move beyond simply surviving today's challenges into thriving. I'm Michael Hunter with Uncommon Teams, and today we'll uncover fresh insights into what it means to lead with today. And joining me is Keith Klain. Keith loves solving organizational problems through better software testing and is passionate about coaching and empowering testers. He's built teams for Fortune 100 firms in the US, the UK, and throughout the Asia Pacific region. And he is an advocate for social workforce development, having delivered training programs for nonprofits to create technology centers in disadvantaged communities. He served as the Executive Vice President for the Association for Software Testing and has received multiple awards for his contributions to the software testing and diversity in tech. Welcome, Keith.
How you doing, Michael?
I'm doing great. Happy to have you here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
When did you first recognize that integrating your whole self and bringing that into everything that you do might be a valuable approach?
Well, I guess I'm going to I will answer your question, but to start, I think, I'm not really sure you ever bring like your whole self to work for a couple of reasons, right? I think one, I think people are complicated, and hopefully they're kind of constantly growing and changing. So whatever your whole self is at any one point in time probably isn't the whole story. And secondly, I think it's probably, good and healthy and perfectly acceptable to kind of reserve some of yourself for your private life. So, jobs aren't normal life. We go to these kind of weird, corporate structures that are totally fabricated, have weird draconian rules and, politics. And then we ask people to, be themselves around that. So I don't think, we would ever choose to spend time around some of these folks unless we weren't in a work structure. So it's kind of a weird environment to be in the first place. So I'm okay with, people having a version of themselves that they bring to work. And I'm personally very private and don't share a lot of things at work, but that's just how I do things. But, to kind of answer your question, right? I've spent the kind of bulk of my career in, financial services and specifically in and around the investment banking and capital markets industry. So it's not traditionally a bastion of respect for the individual. A good, part of the start of my career was kind of in the, shut up, listen, don't screw up culture. So it took me kind of a great deal of time to see the benefits of not doing the kind of Machiavellian kabuki theater that a lot of those places are managed culturally. And I think a book that influenced a lot of my thinking in that was this, I don't know if you might have heard of it. It's called The 48 Laws of Power. I was going around the kind of investment banking business 20 years ago when I started out. And it was a lot of like, Sun Tzu, art of war mentality type of things. Don't overshine the master, type of mentality. But kind of later in my career, when I kind of moved on and had the ability to kind of run things the way I wanted to, hopefully it's not too late in my career, but, it was really when I started working with Barclays, which was a big change program that I was being brought in to run. And kind of larger than I could do just by brute force, you know. So I had big cultural implications. I had a great boss who saw in me, the potential to kind of do things that I probably didn't realize I could do yet. And it's this kind of, global test transformation program, multiple businesses, different technologies, lots of different methods and locations. So the operational kind of change program that I was running really required me to have people propagate the idea. And so therefore, you couldn't just do it all yourself. There was a lot of too many structural issues with that. And so we changed the metrics program, the way reporting worked, the governance. There's kind of multiple CIOs that we had to work with to do that. And we really had to get, people to do it on their own. And that's where I felt like I really another book that kind of influenced me in that time was a book called Rethinking Expertise by Harry Collins, which is really about parts of leadership being almost a go-between and a decoder ring between different parts of the organization. And that requires you to think differently about yourself, about people. And so to me, it was almost an external pressure that required me to think differently about how I communicated, who I was at work, meeting people where they are, because people, as you know, are very resistant to change programs. And it takes a lot to get them to kind of change their behavior. So goal alignment, all those things is where I really kind of felt like that was the first time I see there's a real benefit to part of out of necessity, because I had to do it, to being more authentic and bringing more of yourself to work. So that was really the first time I think I really understood what that meant.
What changes did you see in yourself and in the people that you were working with before you found that book and started applying its lessons and bringing in from the other sources that you had brought up, and after you started doing that?
Yeah, I think the one of the changes in me was that when I stopped kind of playing a lot of the kind of corporate communications game, and just I'm a fairly frank person anyway, and I wouldn't say blunt, but very to the point. And I think when I started to marry that with sharing information, because out of necessity, more people had to know what was going on. And lots of times in organizations, people treat information as currency and leverage. And therefore, there's all sorts of games that get played around that. And so for a big change for me was really being even more open with people about why we're doing things, the strategy, and that open communication, I think, got to be mirrored in my teams. And so therefore, people were starting to be a lot more honest about things. And frankly, when you manage people, I was talking to a bunch of people at KPMG yesterday about this, is that folks that work for you or you're managing teams, they know when you're not sharing everything. They know when you're not telling the whole truth. They're not, we spend all this time, finding and hiring and managing and shepherding the careers of really smart people. And then a lot of folks try and treat them like children, then don't tell them what's going on. So they kind of know anyway. So your own credibility gets undermined rather quickly if you play those games. So I started to see a big uptick in the amount of information that was getting shared with me, which then helped me manage differently and be much more effective in kind of running things or managing change, because change is just such a complicated idea in terms of how people act, what's the reward structure with doing things differently. Can I align towards that? It's a scary thing for folks, particularly in work, when it's all tied up with your income, your family, your outside life. So that was one of the bigger changes that I saw, is that the amount of information flowing back up to me was even more than I anticipated. And the I guess attrition or loyalty or the people buying into what we wanted to do got even greater.
Do you have a sense of which things in particular you were doing that helped encourage that trust back up to grow?
Yeah, I think that the people in general don't want to feel like they're kind of being BS'd, for lack of a, I'm going to use a technical term there, right? That they feel like what they're being told is the truth, or as close to the truth that can be shared, or what you know to be the truth is, and that instills a lot of confidence, right? And there's a feeling of like trust, right? That requires you to be honest about what's going on. And without that kind of base level, that honesty there, that people feel like even if you don't know everything, you're telling them as much as you know. That just instills a level of trust that people feel like, because it's a big responsibility to, shepherd somebody's career. And I really look at it as kind of a participation part. It's not just, I'm the manager and then here's the things you have to do. I mean, I think it's as old school as that sounds, you still see a lot of people managing like that. And you get a lot of very, well, what did you do for me today lately? Attitudes from mid-level managers. It's still a big gap, I think, in particularly in technology management, team management, where people use really kind of unenlightened or pop ideas around how to manage, and I always has looked at it as kind of I'm sponsoring you, I'm trying to what's the word I'm looking for, endorse and advocate for you. That's the in places you can't be, right, or you're not able to be, so in rooms you can't be in, and advocate for my team. So it just builds a high level of trust that people feel like you're not taking credit for their work, you have their best interests in heart, and that they're accurately being represented in the organization. Yeah.
That goes back to what you said at the beginning of we can't maybe ever bring all of ourselves into work or any other context. And maybe one of the things I'm taking from it, what you're saying and the experiences you're relating, is that how much of ourself isn't so important. And especially, as you said, that some of us are comfortable bringing more of ourselves than others are. And that's perfectly okay. What matters more than what percentage we're bringing is how open we are about how much we're bringing, and the communication, how we communicate that. So it's perfectly fine to say, I've got a lot going on at home right now. I'm probably going to be kind of distracted today, for this week or this month. And that can be enough. We don't have to go into the gory details of what that is, where other people may be comfortable saying in more detail what's going on. And that both of those are fine. And the same happens with all the business information, that we may, however much information we're getting from other parts of the organization about changes that are coming, or how a particular shift is or isn't taking hold across different parts of the organization, passing all that on verbatim to the people that we're responsible for and helping isn't necessarily the best way to help them. And navigating that balance of how much do I tell who, when, and why is really challenging.
Yeah, and I think, again, I was just discussing this with a colleague last night, in fact, that how do you manage information throughout your teams? And I tend to, we were talking about deputies, and I tend to have somebody when I'm starting a team, or I'm managing a team, or if I've inherited one. I tend to look for people that are kind of like-minded, have the same, not necessarily do everything the same I do, but our decision-making process is kind of closely aligned. We might have different ways of going about it, but the way we break problems down, and I tend to circle around deputies, that people who can go represent the team in other areas. And then from that, there's kind of like circles of trust that break out by people's experience level, by their personality. I'm a big believer in kind of meeting people where they are. And some folks you have to have more one-to-ones with and can talk to them. They have a hard time, or they're still learning how to control their emotions in the meeting when they might hear something bad, or the information that is and they need to learn and be modeled or worked with on how to handle different levels of information, because you can't tell everybody everything all the time, because some people might not be able to be in a position to do that. So I tend to have circles of trust there, as I think everybody does. But I do make sure that the different. This is like giving a test report, right? I'll give a test report, a different one to the developers than I would to the CIO, than I would to the board, than I would to the program team. The information's the same, but the kind of story that you're telling, the story is the same, but the information within that story is tailored to the audience. So I take the same approach with the information management within my teams, is that different people get different versions of not the truth, but of a story that can be told in the way that they can relate to it, and maybe where they're at in their career or their personality type, so that we're all on the same page. Just people have different flavors of the story that they know they can use that with. So yeah, I'd agree with you on that.
What helps you suss out which way to tell which parts of the story to whom, and in a way that is likely to be enough to let them know that you trust them with the information, and that you're treating them as the smart person that you know that they are, and that they can handle the truth without going so much over that you get in trouble from other people for oversharing, and that you overwhelm them with more information or details than they're ready to know yet.
Well, that to me is, in particular when I'm building a team, or even more so when I've inherited a team. So if I'm working with a team to do a process review, or I do a lot of kind of strategic reviews for for organizations, kind of quality operations and how they do testing. And so it's a fairly resource intensive exercise. So I'm a big believer in, you really have to spend time with people. You have to talk to them. You have to let them present information to you. You have to understand the background, the context, because people and projects don't just happen. They evolve over time, and they're for very specific reasons. So I think you have to put the energy and the effort in to really get to know people, to work alongside them. I'm also a big believer in, you never ask your teams to do things that you wouldn't do. So getting into some testing, looking at the reports, getting into all levels of the organization to understand how they do things in their thought process. Because I think that's probably one of the most important things I do when I'm working with people or working as a manager, is I really want to understand their thought process, right? Why did you make this decision? What were the things that, given the same set of circumstances, would you do differently? Someone else might do differently. But that's a very kind of resource intensive way to do that. And after you kind of break the back of that time period of getting to know your people, and I'm not really talking about, yes, everybody has complicated lives and might need time off, I don't really view that, to your point earlier, as kind of bringing your whole self to work. That's like, just being a decent person. It's like, that's kind of table stakes for being a good person in society, that like if somebody needs time off, they can take it, or that their life is complicated. And then I think post COVID, it's gotten even more complicated with work from home and everyone wanting them back, and some people only have been hired into work from home situations. So it's kind of much more complicated than I think it was. I'll venture to say when you and I both started working, which is probably, you went, not to date us, but you went into work every day, and you went into an office every day. That was definitely the model that I went to. So you kind of, I think in some ways you knew people not necessarily better, but in a more tactile way, where like you were working together. There's so much communication is nonverbal, as we know. So you just have to put the time in to do that and spend a lot of time in the way that I think, again, with my meet people where there are mantra. Some folks don't handle group settings better. They would rather have a one-to-one. Some people, so you have to like figure out what their communication style is, and that's just really putting the time. I haven't figured out any better way to do that than just putting in the time and talking to people and meeting them and working alongside the desk and do that.
How do you build cultures where people feel safe and empowered to not only bring their unique talents into everything they do, but also to be honest with you about, this is how I prefer to communicate. This is how I work best. This is the best way for you to get my best work out of me is to do this, this, and this.
Yeah. So I think to me, I look at it as principles, right? There's principles and practices on how anyone, maybe it's simplistic, but that's, in my view, how people conduct themselves. So one of the first ones that I practice or a principle that I want to have drive my interactions with my team is honesty. And I think, there's two ways to look at that. There's, it's super important to be honest with people if you want to lead with integrity. And that was what we were talking about earlier around, like, people know when they're not being told the whole truth, or they're being spun a story. And I think, being honest first with yourself is super important to make sure you're not deceiving yourself about what you're able to do, what you're not able to do. And particularly when I do kind of quality reviews with organizations, the first thing I'm trying to figure out is, what do I think we can actually get done here? And a lot of that is about an organization being honest with itself. What's our comp structure? What's our incentive structure? What are people do, what they get rewarded for? What are we, actually rewarding people for? And what do we, say we're rewarding people for? And then figuring out that. So that's a lot about being honest with yourself, and ties into that idea of, spending a lot of time hiring and finding and grooming and managing people, and then to treat them like children. I never understood that. So that's a big part of it, because, people, as we said, it was kind of like being a co-steward or stewardship in their career, as opposed to managing their career. That self-reflection and being honest with yourself builds trust. So that to me means like admitting you make mistakes. When did I personally screw up? Sharing information, apologizing when you were wrong. It's like those kind of simple, basic, human interactions that people don't typically get with management. I think builds a lot of trust there. And I think also if you're good at this, or I don't know how you would ever judge whether or not, we definitely grade people in organizations about how good of a manager they are, but I'm not sure how accurate any of that is. But like, you shouldn't be afraid of being honest and sharing information. I had no fear of that. And I think once I stopped kind of playing the information as currency game, that was a big kind of shift in me. And the second one is more of a practice, which is, kind of around communication and making sure that, we're aligned with the business, that we're communicating in a way that people understand, that, talking in stories that are relatable, as opposed to, and you've probably met a few testers in your day. We typically, can be the nerds of the nerds, right? So we're almost like a subset of nerds and speaking languages and codes that a lot of people don't understand. And I spend a lot of time trying to coach testers on how to speak like a human, or at least put the information in ways that are relatable to the business, focus on risk. And that also helps in my kind of meet people where there are mode. You can propagate ideas, you can be relatable, and it's something that you find your way into an idea with people, and then they find their way in. So practicing a lot on communication and preparation for meetings and discussions is is another one. I think another, personally, a principle that I try and bring to work is around kind of humility, right? And his history, and business are full of examples of that typically comes with leadership is a tremendous ego, and I think if you want to be in charge or you want to manage or take responsibility, you're going to have a healthy sense of self-worth anyway, and we've all kind of suffered under, probably at some point in our career, suffered on a kind of, the local egomaniacal narcissist, which nobody really enjoys being around. But I think if leaders that want to drive organizational change, that want to, help people get the most out of, we're spending a lot of time at work, so let's get the most out of it whilst we're there. That requires, a lot of humility. And to me, another book that influenced my thinking on this a lot, and I'm sure you've heard of Jerry Weinberg, but the Secrets of Consulting, which I think is, everybody should read that book if you're in management or in a leadership position, because it's really about, what's the second principle? There's always a problem, and it's always a people problem, and he spends a lot of time talking about, people are weird and squishy and messy, and you have to figure out what makes people tick in order to do that. And in my experience, for me to do that effectively, that requires a level of humility that takes the focus off of other people and puts it on myself. That for when we have challenges, when we've made mistakes, because you're going to make mistakes and things aren't going to go, according to plan. And I think that, I don't like the term servant leadership. I don't know why. For some reason, I don't like that. But it's the idea of not centering yourself in everything and making sure the team is taking full credit for the work that they do. I really try hard not to. I want my team members, no matter how junior, no matter how new to the team, to get the opportunity to present their work. I think there's nothing more frustrating to people who feel like their work is not being represented accurately. So we do a lot of coaching and working on trying to get people in the right room so they can do themselves and learn how to do that. And I think the last thing I would say, and not everybody has the same, I love what I do, right? So I love software testing. I love quality. I love working on that side of it. And I think bringing a certain level of passion to what you do, people align. There's a natural kind of pull, it has a gravitational effect of people wanting to be around folks that are passionate about what they do. It's inspiring. You can learn, it has a lot to do with coming in every day and feeling like, not every day you hit it out of the park, but like people that are passionate about what they do can kind of pick you up in ways that, we're not all, not every job that we have or organization that we work at is the best place we've ever wanted to work. And sometimes it's a job, I say that all the time. It's, we wouldn't be here if they stopped paying us. People would just stop turning up. So there's always that underlying, current of it's a job. But I think, when you're passionate about what you do and people can pick up on that, and maybe it's you're passionate about the people, it's a passion about the organization or the project, that's a natural attractor for people to want to perform, and a lot of times overperform, because they feel like, we're doing something, this amount of time I have on the earth that I'm spending with these folks, at least we're all kind of pulling the rope in the same direction, and we can feel good about that.
There's two words that you said that seem to me to be through lines through everything that we're talking about today. One is stewardship as opposed to management. And the second is translation. And what we really mean, perhaps, when we talk about bringing our whole self into everything that we do, is learning how to steward who we are, and in a way that's always available, so we can always pull on all of that intelligence to help us solve the problem that we have in front of us right now. And that we can do that, we can translate what that is and what we're doing and how we're approaching it and how we perceive the problem in a way that the particular set of people we're talking to right now can understand and receive that. And that's probably going to be different for every set of people and even each individual within those sets of people. And so the best way to build these cultures where people feel safe and empowered, or maybe not the best, but a critical component of building these cultures, is to help ourselves and help our people steward that for ourselves, and then to learn and practice doing that translation.
Yeah, I mean, I use the word stewardship a lot when I'm talking about, like, what people say you're their manager or their line manager, and I'm really talking about the kind of career progression, because the like, I've worked in what I call enterprise tech, right? So this is large banks, UBS, Barclays, Citigroup, Fiserv. These are massive organizations that the HR and all the people management side of it is a behemoth, right, of operational controls and structures that have their self, perpetuating machine. And so there's that part of it, is like navigating performance reviews and everything else that goes through that. Then that's one part that I think, usually comes down to who's the best pitching manager in the room, right? So if you have somebody who's got a lot of organizational clout or influence, and then they're your pitching manager for year-end review or mid-year review or whatever it is, you'll tend to probably just do better under those types of managers than others, which is inherently unfair, but that's just what I've seen over my 20 plus years of doing this. Then I think the other part, what you're talking about, is the kind of the career aspect of it. What do I want to do here? What can I do here? Like, what is going to be meaningful to me? The right balance between, my personal life, the amount of money that I make, my investment in this, because we spend a lot of time at work. So what's the right balance for what I'm going to get out of this? And I've spent swaths of my career being more concerned about my career than my life, and there's a balance that you have to. I think everyone kind of goes through, maybe a pre-kid 30s session of, I'm focusing on my career because I want to get to a different area, and then maybe my values change. So I think the stewardship part to me is like really trying to help people. There's another thing I say all the time, is manage your own expectations, right? So what am I going to be able to do here? What's the culture? Where am I at in my career? What does it take? What do I see? And I see people make this mistake a lot, is they don't look at who's been successful at the organization. What behaviors did they demonstrate in order to get there? And do I want to model that? So if you look at the leadership of your, company you work at, and you're not entirely sure that you want to model that, well, then it's going to have a natural limiting effect on how far you're going to get. So it's really, when I look at it as stewardship, it's a relationship between me and the person whose career I'm trying to help with, where we have a balance between, you're going to make decisions, I'm going to try and bring everything I can to help you make those decisions, but ultimately we're going to kind of do this together based on what you want to get out of this place, if that made sense.
That does make sense. Thank you. In this conversation, I'm realizing that management and stewardship feel different to me. Management to me feels like we are being objective. We are moving things around on board to best create an outcome that we desire. And the desires of the things that we're moving around or may not factor into it as much. It's kind of like really all in our head of moving these puzzle pieces around to best create an outcome. Where stewardship feels more, as you were saying, of a collaboration between me, the person or people, and other structures that I'm working with. And here, the primary outcome is not necessarily the business outcome or the outcome that we are doing this work to create. Or that's a primary outcome, and just as important is the relationship that we're building between us and between the other structures that enables us to create that outcome. And that's strengthening all of that so that we can solve not just this particular problem or create this particular outcome that we're working on at the moment, then also we can create all the other outcomes that come along behind that, all the other problems that we know.
Yeah, I tend to think of that.
We'll encounter next.
Yeah, I agree with that, and you know, I've talked about my management teams about this, and it's different than sometimes go, oh, it sounds like you're being a mentor, right? And and that to me, and I've had some mentors. I've done some mentoring. Actually, I do loads of mentoring, if people want. But that's to me always more. It's all on the mentee, right? You have to come up with the structure and an idea and everything else, and then you bring it to your mentor and say, like, well, what do you think about this? And they try and just listen to you. It's almost like can be treated like therapy. And maybe that's not the way, it's meant to be. But in my experience, that's mostly how I've experienced that. And I think, there's, again, the kind of organizational thing I got to help somebody navigate. I'm actually trying to bring ideas to help them as well based on what I've seen and heard. So it's slightly different than just straight mentoring.
Yes. So it's clear to me what the people and the teams and the relationships get out of focusing on stewardship as well as the management and more traditional business approaches to
I think
finding these solutions.
Yep, sorry. I think it brings, there's a couple things that come out of that. One, for me, I've had when this is in, you don't always get it right, but when you do, the teams are generally very high performing and there's a high trust environment. And that's, to me, a good heuristic or barometer of how well a team is performing together is what their level of trust is. And I've worked with programs in very low trust, and they're always the worst performing teams. When you really trust the people around you, and acceptance and all this stuff, that's your performance just goes up. It just naturally does because you can operate in a way that's best for you. You can feel within that safety of where you're at your edges, and people can pick it up where you are. So I think that just brings with it a higher level of performance. A business value of that is also I've had extremely low attrition in my teams, which, we can this whole other conversation around corporate recruiting and how all that works and what that whole process is really about these days. But like there is a burden and a cost with hiring people. There is a lot of, institutionalized knowledge that leaves when you lose people. It affects the team. It's just constantly poking people when you have attrition. And so having very low attrition is just great for, even if you move around within the organization, that natural cost of trying to find people, recruit people, it just is a natural drag on productivity when you have attrition. The other thing I've seen for folks is that their focus, right, is much more in tune with like a change program. They feel like they're communicating. We're all communicating the same thing, even though we might have different styles. We're all talking about the same stuff. It's those kind of semantical, decoder ring conversations that we don't have to have that all the time. People can just be who they are. So the focus around change programs, you can adapt to markets a lot quicker or changes in your program that are going to happen. And the critical thinking, which is a hot topic right now with AI and outsourcing your critical thinking to, OpenAI. The critical thinking and decision making within my teams is generally a lot higher because they are empowered to make changes because we all understand the goals and there's mechanisms and trust in place to, it's not, the stakes aren't I think people are afraid to make decisions because they feel like the stakes are so high if they screw up. So they would prefer not to be the blade of grass that sticks up and gets cut down first. So when that is gone, people's focus goes up, and generally, I find it that just the quality of life is better. With the the limited amount of time you have left on the planet while you're doing these things together, you generally people are happy, and particularly in like very uncertain times right now where there's like layoffs and markets changing and all sorts of risk that floats through all these different industries. It just people are just generally happier without that stress.
There's a nicely reinforcing cycle here of the more I feel able to bring all of me to the work I do, the more I can bring creativity to the problems I'm solving, the more you and the other people on my team feel able to talk to me about what's going on with them, to have the challenging conversations about where they may disagree with how I am approaching a problem or what the actual problem we're trying to solve here, what the point of the thing that we're trying to do might be. And being able to show up as who we are, have these conversations, builds trust. That lets us show up more as who we are, have more open communications, have more of the deep collaboration that lets us really solve the problems elegantly, innovatively, and which gives us more confidence and ability to show up as more of who we are and build more of that trust. And all this just keeps reinforcing every other piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the things when I was working with Barclays and spent a couple of years in Singapore, which was a very cosmopolitan team. And there were people from all different walks of life, cultures. I mean, you can't work in technology anymore without, it's a very multicultural industry these days, particularly in banking. But when I was there, there was all people from all over the planet, different walks of life, that was really a kind of melting pot of ideas. And being able to then, to me, bringing your whole self to work or being who you are at work, to me as someone who manages programs or kind of talk career management, like people I think conflate you want to wear orange shoes to work with that's bringing my whole self, which might be part of it, but like for me, and I think the focus is on like who are you as a person more than how you're outwardly expressing that. And I think, particularly in more conservative industries, those two one can have a knock-on effect to the other. And I just frankly have never really cared what stripe, how you look, where you came from. I'm more interested in who you are as a person and why you're making the decisions the way you do and how you think about things. And if any of those things influence you, because that's just all more stuff that we can draw on to help solve problems, because particularly in my business, we never know entirely what the answer is. Testing and software quality is just peering into a wall of uncertainty, and gray. We never know exactly what the answer is going to be. We're helping people make risk-based decisions. So anything else you can bring to the party that I want to know who you are enough to understand, well, what type of problem can you help me solve? And that's I think people conflate those two, and then they get upset or they feel like they're not valued because they're only being looked at it from an outward perspective. And organizations should be, really leveraging and valuing people by their experiences to help solve problems, and that's the really important part of it to me, not so much the kind of, I don't want to say, I'll use the word shallow, I'll probably get, beat up for that, but the much more superficial things as opposed to why that makes you who you are and what makes you solve problems the way you do. To me, it's a much more empathetic way of trying to understand how we can solve problems together, as opposed to just like looking at it from that kind of very superficial way. Hopefully that made sense.
That did make sense, Keith. Yeah, I appreciate your focus on the inner over the outer. The inner, sometimes either one can feel challenging to really exhibit and bring. The outer, the filters that constrain what parts of outers we can bring into a particular context often are more visible. There's a dress code that says you have to dress in a certain way, or certain things are not permissible to wear as adornments or accessories. And the constraints that we perceive on how much of which the inner aspects are not always as clear. And simply addressing the ability or not to bring outer aspects doesn't automatically translate into how we feel able or not to bring all those inner aspects. Where focusing on the inner aspects and enabling that can maybe often or typically make it easier to work through whatever constraints I may have on the outer aspects. Because as you said, I understand that my inner core is valued and enabled, and therefore whatever may not seem as valued or enabled on the outer aspects are less important.
No, I agree. And I think, and I take this part very seriously, and part of this is about the, feeling responsible as a manager. Too often in large enterprise organizations, being a manager is just like how many people report to you, and you're part of that kind of like corporate structure HR machine. But really, these folks have, and I take this part very, very seriously, which is the advocacy part, because they trust you to be advocating on behalf of them. So for money, for raises, for a better work environment, and I think if you're not taking that part ultimately the most serious as a manager, you should get out of that business. I really think you shouldn't manage people. And in fact, I think we could probably get by with less managers that had that mind frame than too many people who are managers who don't know how to do it, or they don't understand people, or they don't put any thought whatsoever into how to manage people or what that relationship means. And I guarantee you, particularly in tech, you would struggle to find people who would actually done any research or read anything on it that's not just corporate training, and usually that corporate training is just, how do you navigate our performance management system? It's not, how do you actually talk to people? How do you, manage a career? How do you interact with folks? It's usually pretty poor. And then this next level of hell for people beyond that is folks who don't care about any of that. They only look at it in that strictly Machiavellian, it's a, and organizations haven't helped themselves because they're pyramid structures, and so usually to get ahead or to get a raise or get a promotion, it's a lot about how many people you manage. So there's empire building and, fiefdoms and everything else in here that is really not doing a service to the folks who are doing all the work. So I have a very kind of black and white view on that. Is like, if you're not putting in the investment to learn how to manage people or learn who you're managing or any of that, you should just get out of that business.
How do you help people find their way through all the change, uncertainty, and overwhelm that seems to be life these days?
Yeah, well, I actually wrote a little bit about this recently with the last year's tech layoffs that started. And in my business in testing, it's constantly under threat of, we're going to offshore it, we're going to automate it. Why do we have testers? So we kind of live within that anyway. So I have a few things, that like what I would call a survival guide for people generally in testing, but maybe a little bit more applicable today. And with the uncertainty we seem to be going through yet again. And the first one, I would say is like, understand the commercial implications of your business. Like, how do you make money? What do people care about? Listen to your COO or CFO calls and, understand what they're telling. If it's a publicly traded company, they have investors. Make sure that you understand the language of success within your business that people are rewarded for, and be able to draw a direct line between what you're doing and what those structures care about, right? Because I think that's it helps you be able to communicate in a way that the people who are making those decisions can understand, right? So it's just a good translator anyway, and a good exercise. And so being able to do that and align what you're doing, and when people just look at your job as a kind of below the line cost and it's a black box, then they don't understand the value of what you're bringing. You're usually not in a good place. So being able to understand and speak the kind of language of your business is the first thing. The second one, particularly for testers, is what I call being able to relate what you're doing and what the work you're doing is how it's helping mitigate risk for the organization. And so I would tell people, and with training testers is, think about if the CTO or CIO came into the room today, what was the last critical defect that you found? And what would have happened revenue-wise if you wouldn't have found it, right? And be able to articulate in a business sense the value of what you're doing so that they can take that away, right? Because that, again, draws a direct line. They understand implicitly now what the value is of the role that you're doing, and they won't forget that kind of interaction. Excuse me. And that's again aligning your value towards the business of that you work for. The last thing I would tell people is that, and this is endemic within my business, in the testing business, is people don't know what's going on in our industry. So having a broader view of not just what's testing like in your organization, but what's happening in other companies, what's going on, like listening to talks, go to some conferences, do some research, have a broader view that demonstrates that, again, more value you're bringing to the organization, that you're not just doing things because that's the way we do it here, but you can, there's great resources you can have. I've got some on my website that you can read about, how to stay in tune and kind of keep your finger on the pulse, because again, that just shows a commercial awareness. This is probably the underpinning idea through all of this, is that, you work at a company that, like, what's that? There's a thing going around, a heuristic of, if anybody says, oh, come join our family as a company, that's like a red flag, right? It's not a family. That's usually a good red flag for abuse, but like you work there to get paid. You wouldn't be there otherwise. So having a commercial understanding of what your job is doing, I've just generally puts you in a better place. And then if the worst happens and you are out in the market, all of those things are going to help you land a job as well. Being able to talk to technical recruiters or the other about the business value you brought to the last place you were at, or your commercial understanding of the testing market. So just being able to speak in those terms, I've seen you generally have a better result, even if it's at the individual level, with where you're at, or if you end up and you have to start, looking for a job, the being able to do that you'll get a much better result when talking to interviews and looking for a new company.
So understand the value the business is there to create. Understand how you are enabling and assisting that value creation. Tell the story that connects those two. Translating that into the terms that the particular person or set of people you're talking to right now will understand, which is probably different from what any other person or set of people you're going to tell the story to will want to hear it.
I should have just said that. That was a great summary, Michael.
Thank you. This is one of my superpowers, is asking questions, which I've been doing a lot of, that reframe and clarify. So I don't think I could have come to that short, succinct description without having taken in and cogitated, mulled over, felt into everything that you said first. For people who'd like to talk to you about learning how to do that, value understanding and storytelling translation better, or learn more about having you help them with their testing, any of the other things we've talked about today, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. I have a website. It's www.qualityremarks.com, and it pretty much is a warehouse of all my writing and thinking and interviews I've done and hundreds of hours of video and other stuff on there. So there's a resources page with stuff that's I listen to or read that's influenced my thinking about that. So you can go to the website. I'm also pretty regularly on LinkedIn, contributing to online conversations or posting things. My mug is on the KPMG UK website, our quality engineering website. You can find me there. I'll also be out and about a little bit, which I'm used to do a ton of, but then stopped for a while and now doing again. So last year I gave the keynote at Eurostar, which is a software testing conference. I'll be at Eurostar again this year. I'm not speaking, but I'll be up there. We're doing a big part of the expo. There's a national software testing conference in the UK I'll be at as well. And then there's other industry things. I was at Cybos not too long ago. I'll be at Pay 360, which is a payments testing or a payments industry in banking conference. So I'll be kind of out and about, but most of the stuff is posted to my website or LinkedIn, so it's easy to find me there.
That's great. I'll have those links in our show notes. What would you like to leave our audience with today, Keith?
So two things really. I guess it's just are they related? Is that one? Taking this opportunity as a software tester, software doesn't have to suck. And I think what's happened over the last decades in software delivery has really kind of eroded our expectations as consumers, and we accept crappy software far too easly, and it doesn't have to be like that. And there's some good local or recent rants about that, particularly with AI. But software doesn't have to be as bad as it is. And the other thing is that, kind of speaking on behalf of my people, the software testing community, that there's an entire community of thousands of professional testers in an industry that seems to be constantly trying to eliminate us to their own detriment. And us and these folks, we have just rolled up our sleeves and kind of got on with doing the hard work of testing systems that are ever increasing in complexity, pervasiveness in our lives, and criticality. And we are out there doing that hard work for you.
That sounds great. And thank you for doing that work, Keith. We all appreciate it. Thank you for your time today, Keith. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
And thank you, audience, for being with us today. Keith and I would love to know, how do you appreciate the testers in your life, whether you know that they're there or not? Keith and I are super curious. Thanks, and have a great day.